They left a poor girl in a sack to die. But the cowboy's daughter whispered, "Papa, she's Mama." Western Wyoming, early autumn 1892, held its breath. Frost feathered the grass, and sycamores along Red Willow chimed their last gold. Elias Turner walked the fence line with a hammer and wire, his daughter Lila hopping to keep pace, small boots tapping rhythm on frozen ground. Since his wife's burial, Elias kept his voice quiet. The country did the talking, prints in crusted mud, a bent staple, a hawk's brief cry. He stopped where the river curved, and the bank slumped under a leaning sycamore. There a burlap sack lay half-hidden in reeds, stained dark, the knot cinched tight. A drag mark ran from the water to the roots. Elias sent Lila behind him and drew his knife. The cord parted. He peeled the mouth open and flinched. Inside, a young woman, wrists bound, face mottled with bruises, breath thin, as if the world were a room she heard from the hall. Something small clinked against the burlap, a locket on a frayed ribbon. He thumbed it open. The oval held half a photograph, only an eye and the curve of a cheek, yet the likeness stabbed. It echoed his late wife's gentleness. The sack bore a smeared ink stamp, H.C. Lila, disobeying softly, edged to his knee and studied the stranger with solemn, shining eyes. Her whisper slipped out, thin and certain. "Papa, she's Mama." The river hurried past, carrying secrets. A breath of mist moved through the sycamore's gold, and somewhere far off a horse broke into a run. Elias lifted the woman free, felt heat under the bruises, and saw another mark he did not understand. 2 straight lines burned into the rope, like tally cuts. He looked toward the house, toward town, toward the mountains that kept their own counts. What he chose in that moment would change the valley, and what happened next will shock you. Morning thinned over Red Willow as Elias Turner carried the battered woman toward his place, with Lila pacing beside him. Frost filmed the grass. The house looked tired but upright, boards silvered by years, porch sagging, chimney breathing faint smoke from last night's embers. The barn leaned into the prevailing wind like a stubborn ox. Lila clutched her wooden toy horse and watched the stranger's slack face with a hope that refused to blink. "She needs us," Lila said, voice small, yet steady. Elias adjusted his hold and nodded once. He could have angled for town and the doctor, yet the shortest path ran through his own yard. The sycamores along the creek whispered and shed coins of gold that skittered across the hard ground as if urging him onward. He shouldered the barn door and stepped into air cut with hay dust, leather, and iron. Thin light fell through chinks in the roof, striping tools and feed bins in pale ladders. A straw mattress lay rolled near the oat barrel from spring calving. He spread it and lowered the woman carefully, then fetched a wool blanket from a cedar chest. Lila knelt, placing her toy horse beside the stranger's elbow like a small guardian. "Mama," she murmured with a certainty that pierced him. He said nothing and checked the stranger's breath, feeling a steady but faint draw. He slid a folded saddle blanket under her head and loosened the rope at her wrists with his knife, working gently so the frayed fibers would not bite again. "We should name her," Lila whispered, eyes shining. "Clara." The orban at the woman's temple caught a shaft of light and answered as if the name knew her. Elias wrapped her upbraided hands in his late wife's scarf. The blue flowers faded by wash and sun, and felt heat returning under the bruises. He fetched water, wet a cloth, and dabbed at cuts along the hairline and mouth. Outside, hooves rattled frost. A voice called his name. Another answered, edged with curiosity. The county could smell mystery the way cattle smell rain. He drew the doors nearly shut, leaving a narrow seam of day, then stood straight as figures pooled in that bright slit. Whit Carter set his mare at the threshold, jaw tilted like a man ready to argue and willing to help if pressed. Beside him stood Miss Hale, shawl tight, boots braced, steady eyes taking measure of everything at once. Old Mr. Sutter held reins in a knobby fist. 2 Carter boys craned for a look. Hester Pike balanced a basket in the crook of her arm. "Elias," Miss Hale said, voice even, Who is that woman, and why is she lying in your barn? He tipped his hat. Found under the sycamore, tied and beaten. She's alive. That's what matters. A murmur rippled through the yard, part pity, part warning, like wind gathering before snow, which shifted in the saddle. There's been talk from Hollow Creek, he said. The orphanage burned last week. Folks say a ledger vanished. If that's the one who took it, the deputy will want her. One of the ranch hands spat and added, or she could be tied to rustlers. Pretty faces hide sharp teeth. Mrs. Hale shot the man a look that pinned him quiet. There are laws, she told Elias, and procedures for wounded strangers. You have Lila to think of. Lila hugged the toy horse and moved closer to the mattress, gaze fixed on Clara's battered mouth as if willing it to speak. I am thinking of her, Elias said, and the calm in his tone carried more weight than thunder. Clara deserves a chance to speak before any badge claims. He accepted Hester Pike's basket when she offered it, and found a jar of broth inside. Steam rose when he eased the lid. He poured some into a dented tin cup and held it to Clara's lips. A swallow went down, then another. Color edged her cheekbone. Thank you, he told Hester, meaning the food and the loyalty inside it. Mrs. Hale's mouth softened, yet concern stayed in her eyes like a shadow that would not move at noon. Wind skimmed the sycamores and shook down fresh gold that skittered under the door. The air held a bite that tasted of iron. Somewhere a hawk lifted its call, thin and high. Cattle shifted in the lower field, hooves thudding softly. Inside, the stove ticked toward warmth while the lantern pooled honey light over straw and leather. Lila sat cross-legged and stroked Clara's hair with two careful fingers. Mama, she breathed, the word both prayer and promise. Elias felt old aches surge and settle, then anchored himself with work checking pulse, cleaning wounds, tucking blankets where cold tried to slip in. Outside, voices tightened. Doc Myers should be fetched. Tell Deputy Lyle before rumors grow teeth. Mercy first. Law first. Opinions collided and stuck. Elias stepped to the entry and drew the doors until only a sliver of light remained, then dropped the crossbar. The sound cut the noise like a clean axe. You barring us out? Whit called, not angry, only testing. I'm keeping wind off a wounded person, Elias answered. Mrs. Hale lifted her chin. I'll bring the doctor and come back. He nodded, accepting help while refusing control. A narrow path he had walked since grief taught him to balance without a rail. Time moved strangely, measured by Clara's shallow breaths and the slow swing of the lantern flame. Lila hummed a child's tune she half remembered, pausing to feed a crumb of bread into Clara's hand as if nourishment could travel by touch. Through the scene at the threshold, frost glare brightened, then eased as a cloud slid over the sun. Miss Sutter cleared his throat and delivered his verdict to the yard. If she did wrong, the badge will sort it. Until then, a man's barn is his word. The ranch hands muttered but fell back a step. Elias placed the locket on the workbench and opened it again, seeing the half-image inside and refusing to chase meanings the valley would happily supply. When the yard thinned, Mrs. Hale stayed a breath longer, her face framed in the narrow slice of day. Be wise, Elias. Compassion can draw fire. He met her look. I know, I will keep them safe. She nodded once and turned away, boots whispering through a drift of sycamore leaves bright as coins. The breeze stiffened. The smell of distant wood smoke slid under the sill. Somewhere a bell clanged from town. Elias settled the crossbar deeper into its brackets and stood with his back to the doors, listening to the uneasy quiet on the other side fade down the road. Inside the warm circle, Lila held Clara's hand and told her about the pony in spring, the creek in summer, and the way autumn painted every hill with gold. He banked the stove, checked the knots he had cut, and straightened the blanket. Outside, wheels creaked and hooves faded. Within that rough shelter, choice hardened into duty, and duty into resolve that would not yield to fear tonight. The barn kept a warmer breath than the night, yet cold slid under the sill, while the autumn wind rattled the boards like a hand testing every latch. Clara lay on a straw mattress with a folded saddle blanket under her head and a wool cover to her chin. Her lashes trembled, then stilled as her mind neared waking and receded before ache. Elias worked in quiet loops, Heat water, steep willow bark. Cool a tin cup. Raise her, tip a sip. Lower her, check each bandage, wash bruised skin. He had steadied foals and lambs in harsher storms. The same patience fit a bruised stranger. Lila sat on a milking stool, small boots braced, the toy horse at her knee. She spoke in a hush meant for quilts and a stove, not rafters and harness hooks. Mama tied my braid with a blue ribbon, and the bow sat sideways because I wriggled, she said, smoothing Clara's hair as if memory could shape the present. She put honey on cornbread so the crust shone. We hid nuts for the red squirrel. We named the first calf Tulip. Her voice did not crack. Hope held it together. Elias fetched his late wife's scarf from the cedar chest, a square with faded blue flowers, and wrapped it around Clara's abraded wrists, as a soft cuff against the rough blanket. The fabric had carried years of kitchen steam and summer dust. Now it carried a promise he could not yet speak. He checked that circulation returned, then set his palm above the knot and felt warmth gather under the skin. Outside, wheels creaked on frost, hooves stamped, and voices braided into uneasy strands that tugged at judgment, but never formed certainty. He lit a second lantern to keep shadows from frightening her, trimmed both wicks and spread the light into corners. In that glow, Clara's face showed a nick at the hairline, several splinters along one cheekbone, and a bruise dark as distant thunder. He heated a needle, cooled it, and lifted each tiny shard with the point, counting under his breath to steady his hand. When she flinched, he waited until her breath leveled. The barn breathed with them, stove ticks, leather creaks, grain settling in the bin. Have you ever protected someone without knowing their story? Reflect on that moment. The question rose with the tea's steam, a private summons to conscience. Lila's eyes never wavered. You're safe, Mama, she whispered, laying her fingers over Clara's, and then drawing back, as if to prove she trusted safety to stand without her touch. The word became a bridge between grief and hope, and she stepped onto it as if bridges were built for brave children. A boot scraped outside. Whit Carter's baritone cut the yard. Elias Lyle rides at sunup. Best hand her over before tongues light. Hester Pike answered, steady as fence post. Let a hurt woman have a night. Dawn can still count. Mr. Sutter muttered about the weather and scents. Someone swore softly. Wind pushed the latches to a hollow clatter, like a clock reminding that time insists. Outside, the sycamore leaves skittered like bright coins. Elias moved a hay bale against the doors, not as a dare, only to keep draught and impatience out. His silence carried farther than argument. Clara stirred. Her hands searched as if a lost thing might be right there if only she remembered its shape. When her fingers found the scarf, they closed in a slow, grateful grip. She tried a word, only a rasp arrived. Elias leaned close. Easy, he said, voice low and even, more a place than a sound. Her lids lifted a sliver, hazel catching lantern light. Lila slid down and guided the toy horse into her palm. He doesn't scare, she said. I don't either. Elias cooled another sip and watched color creep along Clara's cheekbones like dawn testing the rib. He tucked the blanket where the draft sneaked in, then checked the cut rope marks. No angry swell now, only tender circles fading under the cloth. Smells layered in the room. Hay, oil, wood smoke, damp earth, willow tea. Outside, townsfolk shifted again. If she's innocent, the judge decides. If she's guilty, why hide her? Law first, mercy first. The barn did not answer. The wind answered with another rattle along the eaves. Lila resumed in a soft, steady cadence that finds a listener even in sleep. She told of washing apples in the creek, until knuckles ached from cold, of a blue cup with a chip shaped like Idaho, of sunlight through porch lattice, turning dust to sparks. She did not skip the hard parts. The day fever came. Everything sounded far, she said. The stove kept burning. The pony waited at the fence. Papa carried water and never dropped it. She paused. If you wake, Mama, I'll fetch the ribbon. From time to time, a knuckle tapped the door, bargaining with certainty. Surrender by morning, call the deputy now, open the gate for a look. Elias answered by not answering. His stillness filled gaps stronger than any nailed plank. In that quiet refusal lived a promise, and even men who disliked it recognized its spine. After a while the taps fell silent, taken by wind and distance. When Clara drifted again, he scraped ash from the stove, fed another stick, and set the locket on the bench without chasing meanings he could not trust. He pressed 2 fingers under her jaw and counted. Strong. He rested his hand near, not touching, letting shared warmth form in the small space between. Lila battled sleep with stubborn blinks, and rested her cheek on the mattress edge. "Tell me when she wakes," she said. "I will," he answered. The gusts eased to a steady hum. Leaves piled against the threshold, coins bright even in dim light. A horse stamped, then quieted. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. Lanterns wrote gold along beams and made the scarf's flowers look new. Clara's breathing deep. Between moments, she edged her hand toward Lila's fingers, as if choosing a direction. The child smiled without moving anything else. "Mama," she breathed, not pleading now, naming. Near midnight the sky cleared. Stars burned holes through the dark, and the creek's thin music threaded the pauses between gusts. Elias listened the way men listen, who know the country as king. Rumor tugged. Hollow Creek, a ledger, tally cuts burned into rope, but he refused to weave guesses into a noose before her voice could lay its own pattern. He had seen stories race to an ending by fear. He would wait. He would stand at a gate no one could close. At last the yard emptied. One cart rolled away, another followed. Hester's goodnight fell back like a shawl over edges. The doors ceased their fretful clatter. Within, the quiet turned companionable. Lila yielded to sleep with the toy horse tucked between her hand and Clara. Elias drew his coat close, and kept the watch a father keeps when a line is drawn, and nothing remains but to honor it. Night wore on. The scarf held. The wind talked itself tired and healing, slow and stubborn, began to take hold. Dusk slipped over Red Willow like a shawl, while frost crept from the creek and sycamores tossed down coins of gold. Elias Turner stood on his porch, with a lantern behind him, chimney smoke lifting a thin ribbon into a sky bruised violet. Lila clung to his coat, small fingers tight, the wooden horse hugged to her chest. The barn sat barred across the yard, warm light breathing through its seams, where Clara lay wrapped in wool and his late wife's scarf. Hooves and wheels gathered on the road, then a dozen silhouettes spilled into the yard with lanterns wagging and voices threading caution with heat. Deputy Lyle rode at the front, hat low, badge catching sparks with every step of his bay. Whit Carter, Hester Pike, Miss Sutter, the Carter boys, and several hands followed. Lyle reined at the porch and let his horse breathe steam into the cold. "Evening, Turner," he called, voice careful. "You've got a woman in that barn. She's wanted for questions about a blaze at Hollow Creek and a ledger gone missing. By law and by simple sense, you'll turn her over." Elias felt Lila's grip tighten. He rested his hand on hers so she could borrow steadiness. "She hasn't woken to speak," he said. "Until she does, she stays." A run of whispers passed through the gathering like wind through wheat. Hester hugged her shawl. Mr. Sutter folded his arms and grunted. A colt stamped frost to powder. Lyle swung down. He tugged off his gloves and stepped to the bottom step, leaving only a board and a breath of icy air between them. "I respect your name," he said, "but a badge doesn't pause for sentiment. Bring her out." Lila lifted her chin. "She's Mama," she whispered, nailing hope where nothing else could hold. Mrs. Hale pushed forward, skirts brushing leaves. Her voice snapped. "Elias, think of Lila's safety. Harboring a stranger ties your door to other people's quarrels. If that ledger marks men with money and guns, they'll follow smoke to this yard." Elias kept his eyes level. "I am thinking of Lila," he answered, "and I am thinking of the battered soul inside. What good is a town if it cannot spare one night of grace?" While a voice gathers itself, wind shook the sycamores. Gold-dotted hats and shoulders settled on the deputy's sleeve. Children drawn past bedtime by rumor stared with solemn eyes. Lyle's patience thin. Men who burn buildings don't love witnesses. Buyers who turn children into figures in a ledger don't leave papers lying around. "If she has that book, I need it," If she lit that fire, I need her truth before daylight. Stepping between law and a suspect carries a cost. Elias let the quiet answer first. You can stand in my yard, he said. Come with paper at dawn, and I will not bar the door. But I won't drag a half-conscious woman into cold and rumor. Unease moved through the crowd. Hester said, let the doctor try first. Whit added, if she wakes, we'll fetch you. Mr. Sutter pointed at the stars. Lyle saw decency pushing against fear, nudged by steadiness that can bend a bank grain by grain. Inside, Clara stirred. A thin gasp slipped out, and a tremor ran through the barn wall. Her hands clutched the carve as if it were an anchor in black water. Her eyes rose half open, caught the lantern glow, and fell shut. Lila heard the sound, and squeezed her father. She's scared, she said. Elias turned his head a fraction toward the barn. She holds to the cloth that belonged to my wife, he told the deputy. She isn't fleeing. She's clinging to the first kindness allowed in a long while. A hush landed. The deputy looked past Elias to the barred door, then back. When have you stood up for someone against the odds? Think about it. The night seemed to stamp the words on frost. Jawlines shifted. Mrs. Hale drew her shawl tight, wrestling duty against compassion. I'll sit the outer fence until morning, she said. If anything stirs, we rouse the deputy. But I won't push that door before the doctor tries. Lyle let the quiet stretch. When he spoke again, the edge had cooled to steel. You're buying trouble, Turner. If the orphanage burned for that ledger, men with money won't rest. And if she sparked it, you're feeding crime under your roof. I'm buying ours, Elias replied. Truth can afford that much. He eased Lila behind him with a gentle pull, very gently, then stepped forward until his boots touched frost, left by the deputy's heel. No weapon was shown, only a man filling his threshold so completely that another would have to trample pride to cross it. Lyle measured that line and understood that forcing it tonight would gain less than it cost. Wind sharpened. The creek whispered colder news. Leaves skittered across the yard and piled against wheels. Breath showed, then faded. Lantern flames lifted and sank, painting faces with wavering gold. Clara's breath quickened again. Elias heard it because men who keep vigil learn how sound travels through wood. He pictured the scarf and the half-lidded eyes testing the shape of safety. Lila pressed the toy horse to her heart. Stand down for tonight, Whit told the deputy. Come back at first light with paper. No one here is letting this vanish. Lyle pulled on his glove. He stepped off the frost onto packed earth, then mounted in one smooth motion. At sunrise, he said, come cleanly to the door. If she's here, she rides with me. If she's gone, you answer for it. I'll be here, Elias answered. The deputy turned his horse. The crowd loosened, a knot giving up one strand at a time. Mrs. Hale sent 2 men to watch the road, and another to sit under the sycamore. Hester touched the porch rail, as if laying a blessing in the grain. Lanterns drifted toward the lane. Before Lyle reached the road, he twisted in the saddle. Understand me, he called. If harm comes of this, I won't weigh motives against the law. Consequences don't bargain. Elias gave a single nod. The silhouette thinned into dusk, until badge, hat, and horse were only shapes against a colder blue. Frost reclaimed scuffed patches where people had stood. Gold leaves fell again, not whipped by argument now, only by night. He crossed the yard and lifted the bar. Warmth rolled out, carrying hay, smoke, leather oil, and a faint ribbon of willow tea. Lila hurried inside and knelt by the mattress. Clara's fingers were still locked on the scarf. They loosened when the child's palm covered them, then tightened again, not from panic now, but recognition. Elias set a log on embers and coaxed a taller flame. Light climbed the beams and wrote soft fire along iron tools. He touched Clara's brow. Cooler. Rest, he murmured. We bought you the night. Outside, the last murmurs died. Stars pricked through the thin cloud. The creek kept its hush. Inside, breath found a steadier rhythm. The scarf held. The night settled into a fragile balance that might last until dawn, though winning it had cost every soul in the yard a measure of nerve. The fire in the small stove sighed while the barn kept its hush. a circle of warmth holding back a wide Wyoming cold that rang thin beyond the boards. Frost traced pale runes across the tiny window, and one lantern spread a soft glow over beams, bridles, and the straw mattress where the bruised woman lay. She rose from darkness like a swimmer breaking a winter river, opened her eyes to gold light and a blue scarf, and flinched at the ache that traveled under her skin. Elias Turner crouched beside her with a porcelain mug whose faded flowers showed years of washing and long evenings. The cup had once lived on the kitchen shelf when laughter still warmed the house. He lifted her shoulders with a steady hand and set the rim to her lips. Water carried iron and snow, clean as a first truth. Her throat worked, breath steadied, the room sharpened. Lila knelt at the mattress edge with a wooden horse in her lap, hair escaping its braid, cheeks bright from holding hope through a long dusk. The child studied the stranger's eyes the way one studies the line between dream and morning. Confusion crossed the bruised face like a cloud. She looked from the lantern to the scarf to Lila, then to Elias, and tried a word. Only a rasp came, thin as paper. "Where am I?" Elias kept his voice even. "Safe," he said. "My barn by Red Willow." She touched the scarf at her wrists as if it might remember what she could not. The fabric felt warm, almost alive, scented faintly of cedar and smoke. She searched behind her eyes for a name, found a blank field, and winced as panic nipped at its edges. Elias lowered the mug, waited until her breath settled again, then lifted it so she could drink more. Lila leaned closer. "The scarf was Mama's," the child whispered. "It helps." The woman nodded without meaning to, letting the cotton anchor her. She looked at the little horse, then at the girl's earnest face, and a muscle unclenched along her jaw. Elias set the mug on a crate and spoke gently. "Can you tell us who you are?" Silence carried the question to the rafters and back. The answer did not come. She closed her eyes as if a word might step forward if she kept very still. None arrived. Icy air slipped under the sill and met the stove's breath in a thin truce. Lila's voice tiptoed into the gap. "If you don't have a name right now, we can lend one until yours finds you," she said with serious grace. She reached toward a ribbon of auburn hair that glinted where lantern light struck it. "Clara," she decided softly, as if listening to the color itself. Elias glanced at his daughter and then back to the woman. The syllables settled like a blanket, light but sure. The woman opened her eyes again and tried the new name inside her mouth. "Clara," she repeated, and the word seemed to carry a small raft of calm. "What name would you give to someone starting anew?" Imagine it. The question rode the warm air between them, as quiet as prayer, asking more of the listener than of the stranger. Clara breathed in, and the barn's scents, hay, leather oil, wood smoke, threaded the emptiness with something like belonging. She held the scarf, thumb tracing a faded flower, and let fragments rise like leaves unpinning from a branch. "A horse," she murmured. "Chestnut, clean tap, wind in my ears, a trail along cottonwoods." I felt safe. Her brow tightened. The saddle creaked. Not old, cared for. Someone rode beside me. I can't see a face. She swallowed and fought the heaviness that turned every shadow into a warning. Elias did not press. He sat on a milking stool, shoulders quiet, hands open on his knees as if catching whatever words chose to fall. Lila shifted closer and laid her palm lightly on Clara's bandaged hand. "Papa says the creek sings when it freezes," the child offered, as if a true thing might guide another true thing to the surface. Clara listened to that small voice and let it steady her. Memory flickered again. "A gate clanged," she said. "Smoke somewhere that wasn't firelight. A ledger. Pages that felt wrong in my hands. The rest broke apart." Her breath hitched. Fear rose like black water. She tightened the scarf until her knuckles blanched, then tried to sit and found her strength still thin. The lantern hissed. The stove outside the creek ran cold under stars, and frost took the field plank by plank. Elias lifted the mug once more. "Slow," he said, the single word carrying no judgment. She drank and tasted steadiness. Lila rubbed small circles over the back of Clara's hand. "Mama," the child said, the title spoken with careful certainty, not as a claim on the past, but as a promise about the future she wanted to build. The woman's eyes glossed. She met the child's gaze and did not look away. If a name could be borrowed, perhaps kinship could be too, at least long enough to cross the night. Wind rattled the doors and shook down one last braid of gold leaves from the sycamore beyond the wall. The sound traveled through the wood like distant applause. Clara watched the lantern sway, then with effort, let her muscles relax into the mattress. Elias adjusted the blanket along her shoulder, checking the rope marks that had started to fade, then draped the scarf a little higher, so cotton kissed her throat where bruises would otherwise run. He turned the mug in his hands and studied the flowers worn by years of washing, the exact cup his wife had used when fevers needed soothing. He did not speak of that loss now. He let the cup carry what words could not help. Clara drew a long breath. "If I rode with someone, why can't I see them?" she asked, more to the ceiling than to the man or child. Silence answered, kind rather than cold. It permitted not knowing and kept company with it. She tried another thread. A road curved toward hills, she said slowly. A white fence, hoofbeats steady as a clock. There was a rhythm at my side. I think I trusted it. The last phrase cracked something open. Tears welled without heat, the kind that come when the body recognizes a shelter it cannot name. They slid over bruises and disappeared into the scarf. Elias handed the cup again and waited. Lila reached for a corner of her own braid and tugged it straight, as if preparing for a blessing. Clara laughed once, a small, surprised sound at the child's solemn ritual, and then covered her mouth as if joy might be an offense in a room that had held so much pain. No one corrected her. The fire answered with a brighter lick, and the lantern lifted its pulse. Elias spoke in the tone a man uses to calm skittish stock. "You're safe here tonight," he said. "Morning will bring the deputy and questions. Until then, all we ask is bread." Clara nodded, though worry pinched again at the mention of dawn. She glanced toward the door as if expectation itself might kick the panel and stride in with cold hands. Lila shook her head and slid closer. "I'll sit right here," the child promised. "If you wake scared, I'll tell you about the blue cup with the chip shaped like Idaho, and the pony who likes thistles, and the creek that turns to lace. I remember lots. I can lend you some until yours comes back." The offer landed so gently that Clara could not refuse it. She closed her eyes and let trust move an inch deeper. Elias straightened the bandage at her temple, removed 2 splinters he had missed, and cooled the skin with a damp cloth. Each small act made a different kind of map, one that did not demand destiny. Outside, hooves rang on the road, and then faded. A watcher shifted on the fence. The night resumed its measured roll. The stove clucked softly, happy with its new stick. The lantern's halo sat warm over straw, tools and the sleeping corn. Clara opened her eyes again and studied the man's posture, the girl's patience, the way the scarf stitched present care to a vanished past. If she could not find her old name, perhaps she could pick up this one and carry it until it fit the shape of her spirit. She turned the thought like a pebble and felt it smooth an edge inside her. "Clara," she said again, firmer now. It did not answer everything. It did answer tonight. Elias nodded, a quiet acceptance that granted dignity without ceremony. Lila grinned and settled her cheek near the woman's shoulder, careful not to press. Mist gathered on the window. Frost traced it with lace. Stars burned on the other side. The creek kept singing, thin and tireless. Somewhere a cow called to her calf, and the sound floated through the woods like a lullaby. Clara matched her breathing to the stove's small size and the child's even rhythm. The scarf, warm from that steady pulse, no longer felt like borrowed comfort. It felt like a threshold. When sleep returned, it came not as a fall but as a choosing. She let go. The night held. The barn, firelit and sure, watched over a name newly spoken, and a bond newly born, while winter waited outside and found no invitation at the door. Outside, the cold Wyoming night pressed close, stars brittle above the sycamore. Inside the firelit barn, trust gathered by inches as steam lifted from the porcelain mug. The scarf held its warmth. Lila whispered "Mama" once more, and Clara let the name settle like shelter against doubt and fear. Night hardened over red willow until stars looked hammered into metal. The barn held a small sun of stove heat and lantern glow around straw, tools, and the cot where the bruised woman slept with a blue scarf at her throat. Elias Turner checked her pulse, adjusted the blanket, and listened to the wind worry the doors. A horse came on the Cheyenne road, rhythm clean, rider balanced. He tied off at the fence and crossed the yard as if cold had no claim. He knocked once. Elias opened. A lean man stood there, hat low, coat salted with dust, eyes steady. "Amos Reed," he said. "Detective Cheyenne. I'm following a fire that ate the Hollow Creek Orphanage. Witness says a woman escaped with a ledger naming donors, buyers, and children who vanished. Some swear she lit the blaze to hide theft. Word is you found a bound stranger under a sycamore." Elias blocked the frame. "She's hurt. She hasn't told her story. Until she can stand, she stays." Reed drew a folded writ with a judge's scrawl and a cold seal. "This gives me leave to detain anyone tied to that blaze and the ledger's disappearance. Bring her out, and we'll ride before your deputy complicates it." "Paper carries power," Elias said, "not certainty. You ask me to push a half-healed soul into frost and rumor. I won't." Reed's mouth twitched, not a smile. "Mercy is honorable. It also paints a target on your door. Men named by that book keep friends who like to smoke. If the ledger is here, they will come." He angled his head toward the barn. "I need her, and I need it." "You'll have a voice at dawn," Elias answered. "Not before." The detective weighed the line like a trader studies grain. "Then I'll wait on the road," he said. "If she runs, I follow. If hired riders appear, I'll greet them first." He slipped the writ away and vanished into the iron air. Elias lowered the bar and stood while the latch sang under the wind's finger. He crossed to the cot. The scarf warmed the marks at Clara's throat. Her breath moved evenly. Sleep, however, has thin walls when fear has lived long inside. Reed's words sifted through the boards and stitched themselves to half-formed memories. Firelight too bright, pages too heavy, doors that locked from the wrong side. Clara woke into a panic that did not announce itself. It simply occupied the body. She kept still until her head cleared. The lantern threw steady honey across rafters. Lila slept curled near a crate, arms around a wooden horse. Clara touched the scarf, slid her feet to the floor, and waited for pain to tell the truth. It did, firm but not paralyzed. She wrapped herself in Elias's spare coat, eased to the rear stall, and slipped through a board that left a narrow way to the night. Frost gave the yard a brittle shine. The sycamore's last leaves ticked along the ground like coins. Stars hung hard and close. Clara limped for the fence, found a foothold, and dropped on the far side, breath burning. She chose the ridge, not the road. Hills keep secrets better than houses, and if men with guns were coming, she would be far enough to pull danger away. Minutes later, a hinge whisked. Lila reached for the cot and touched only cooling straw. Her chest hitched. "Mama's gone." The cry speared silence. Elias was moving before the last word broke. He caught gloves, lifted a lantern, blew it out to save his night vision, and told Lila, "Stay with Mrs. Hale. I'll bring her back." At the fence he knelt where moonlight limned the ground. The tracks told a story. Toe pressed deep, heel light, stride short, right leg sparing weight, direction toward the ridge. He breathed once to settle his pulse into the land's rhythm, then followed. The night widened, star-pricked and clear. Frost reached through his boots and climbed his bones. He matched her path, placing his feet where hers had been to keep the trail from fraying. Here she'd stumbled, here she'd braced a palm, here a thorn had caught auburn strands, here she'd stood to find breath. With each sign, determination firmed, not loud, a tightening of spine that would not negotiate with cold or fear. Halfway up, the wind hardened. The ridge showed its ribs against the sky. He found her curled beside a fallen branch, head down, arms wrapped around ribs that complained all day. One boot held a crust of dried blood at the seam. The scarf rose and fell faintly. She tried to rise when his shadow crossed her, then sagged when recognition reached her eyes. "It's me," he said. No speech, no lecture, just the shape of safety and sound. He slid one arm behind her shoulders and another under her knee. She felt lighter than earlier, a trick of shock and hunger. When he stood, the ridge pulled like a thief. He adjusted until her weight settled where he could carry it without losing breath. They descended while the sky sparkled with a kind of beauty that ignores suffering. Ground popped softly under his heels. Breath drifted white. Clara pressed her face to his coat and worked around pain in small, stubborn measures. "I can't bring knives to your door," she murmured. "Bring yourself," he said. "We'll handle knives." At the fence he paused to catch his breath. A square of lamplight glowed in his window. Inside that square a figure moved, hope warring with dread. When he lifted Clara over the rail, she bit back a cry and clung with both hands, until his chest told her she would not fall. He climbed after, and crossed the yard without rushing. Speed breaks fragile things. Care keeps them. Mrs. Hale opened the house door, face tight with worry. She shepherded Lila into the barn as Elias laid Clara onto the cot. Heat pooled from the stove. Smoke met hay and leather oil. He tucked the blanket to her chin, checked the bandage at her temple, then added a stick to the fire until iron purred. Lila pressed her cheek to the scarf and sobbed in jerks that shook her body. "Don't go," she said, raw with relief and fear. Clara took the child's hand and kissed the knuckles. Guilt and gratitude tangled until neither stood alone. "I tried to shield you," she whispered. "I thought leaving would pull danger away." Elias poured water, dashed in a thread of spirits and touched the mug to her mouth. "Freezing on a ridge does not spare us," he said, voice like oak. "Let us carry weight with you. That's how families begin." Outside, Reed's horse stamped at the road. The detective kept his watch without intruding. The ridge settled back to listening. A breeze found the sycamore and shook loose a ribbon of gold. Stars burned through the seam of the shutter. Inside, firelight thickened. A mug steamed. Lila's fingers stayed, and Clara's breath even. Fear had not vanished, but Elias's resolve gave it borders, and the icy night could not cross the threshold stubborn care had drawn. They chose the cottonwood at mid-morning, when frost still clung to the grass, and the sun turned every blade into a thin shard of glass. The plains rolled golden beyond red willow, and the creek stitched silver through the low ground, quiet as a kept promise. Elias spread a quilt beneath the tree where the wind softened and smelled of sap. Lila came with a handful of crayons and a scrap of paper, cheeks pink from the cold wooden horse tucked under her arm like a talisman. Clara eased herself down with a wince that traveled through her ribs and settled, then breathed slowly until pain released its hold. Elias sat close enough for warmth, far enough for dignity, one hand open on the quilt in silent offer. Lila lowered herself between them and drew a sun in the corner of the paper, then outlined a tree with an earnest, careful hand. Clara fixed her eyes on bark and branch, found a center, and began. Her voice trembled at first, a thin wire that threatened to snap, then found tone. She told them she went to Hollow Creek because whispers about lost children had grown louder than her own heartbeat. Cheyenne merchants traded the rumors with flour and nails. A stable hand spoke of nighttime wagons. A laundress swore numbers never added up. Clara had worked there before the blizzard, remembered a storeroom with a high shelf and a stubborn lock near the kitchen. She returned with a bundle of mended clothes and a resolve she had no words for yet. A matron named Corbett stood in the doorway, starch hard in her collar, and smiled. Clara carried the basket down the hall, waited for kettles to hiss, and slipped to the storeroom. The lock stuck. As always, she pressed her shoulder, eased it with a breath, and stepped into dust and stacked ledgers. She pulled one free. The binding creaked like a bone. Inside, neatly ruled columns ran across brown paper. Names, ages, notes about hair or eyes, dates and amounts paid in looping hands. Sometimes the amounts were small, sometimes large, and never explained. She read entries that said a girl of 6, spirited, 20, a boy of 8, quiet, 40, a pair of brothers, 50, then a word she did not want to understand, delivered. Her palms sweated. At the margin, in a different ink, she saw letters that matched the stamp she had glimpsed on the sack by the sycamore, and her stomach turned. A floorboard sighed. A shadow filled the doorway. Corbett stepped forward with a ladle the size of a hammer. 2 men came behind her, smelling of smoke and last night's whiskey. Corbett said curiosity cuts throats. Clara answered without planning to, not children's. The first blow came fast, a white pop that scattered the room. When sound returned, rope bit her wrists and a gag scratched her tongue. She remembered being dragged across stone, remembered cold under her spine, remembered a voice saying, "Ledger first, girl after, we are not paid for mercy." She woke again beside water, burlap scraping her cheek, a knot grinding against bone. She thought she would die there, and the creek would carry everything she ever knew into gravel and weeds. Her hands shook while she spoke, and Elias closed his fingers over hers so she could borrow steadiness. Their hands made a single warm shape on the quilt. The cottonwood held the light, and winter edged the air with a bright, clean knife. Lila drew on, tongue caught between her teeth, intent as a preacher. She sketched 3 stick figures and shaded the sky with slow strokes, then glanced up with solemn approval, as if the drawing had chosen the right family by itself. Clara continued. Before the men had dragged her, she had torn a ledger free and hidden it behind a loose stone under the coal chute. A boy named Simon had shown her the gap weeks earlier, when he came for soap flakes. While smoke thickened and people shouted, Simon whispered to her to crawl, then ran toward the dormitory, promising to wake the littlest ones. She never saw him again. Maybe he made it out. Maybe the numbers swallowed him. She pressed her fist to her mouth and let the thought pass so she could finish. Elias did not ask for more than she could give. Have you ever felt a person listen so completely that your fear lost its argument? The quiet under that tree had that quality. Clara spoke of fire in the kitchen, of doors barred from the outside, of tart smoke that did not smell like clean wood, of men who moved with purpose no charity house should know. She described initials beside the largest amounts, letters that belonged to men who rode heavy horses and kept their boots polished when every child went barefoot. Elias's jaw set, not with rage but with clarity. He squeezed her hand once. Lila slid the finished drawing into Clara's lap. On the page, the 3 figures stood under a sun that wore ridiculous rays. Between the taller shapes, a small horse pranced, forever cheerful. Lila tapped each shape in turn. Papa, Mama, me. She said it like a blessing. Clara's breath hitched. She tried to thank the child, but nothing came. Tears gathered and rolled clean across bruises. She did not hide them. Elias reached with his free hand and brushed one away with a finger that had mended wire all morning and gentled frightened calves all spring. He said nothing because nothing would do better than this steady touch. The plains shone gold for miles, brittle and generous at once, and the air glittered where the sun struck frost. Clara leaned against the trunk so the bark could carry some weight. Her voice steadied to a truer line. She could show the place behind the chute where the book lay if the flames had spared that wall. She could mark initials, trace payments, list dates, and match the ledger's hand to the matron's receipts. She could testify that children were sold like stock by people paid to keep them safe. She could point to buyers whose names townfolk spoke with deference at church. She said she feared what sunrise would bring, yet feared more what silence would keep. Elias nodded. We will go, he said. We will bring the deputy to the stone. We will stand with you while the book speaks, and then we will stand again when men try to make that speech disappear. Lila pressed her drawing against Clara's palm until the paper warmed. We already belong, the child said, as if declaring a fact that the weather could not change. Clara laughed once through tears, a small startled sound that opened a window inside her chest and let in air. She bent and kissed Lila's hair. Belief that rare weather gathered under the cottonwood. Elias's quiet strength, Lila's fearless innocence, and Clara's raw truth arranged themselves into something like a vow spoken without ceremony. The golden plains heard it. The frosty air held it. The creek carried it forward. Clara wiped her face, sat straighter, and laced her fingers with Elias's. She repeated her name, now certain. She told them she felt frightened but no longer alone. She told them that the sack by the sycamore had not been the end of a life. It had been a door. Lila lifted the paper family toward the sun, and the white rays shone through thin spots and made the figures glow. They rose from the quilt together. The day stayed cold, the season stayed dangerous. Yet under that tree the past found its witness, the present found its courage, and the future, sketched in crayon, stepped closer with small, certain feet. The cottonwood shadow shifted while noon inched forward, and the creek kept its silver stitch. Elias passed Clara the porcelain mug, and waited until the steam quit trembling. She drank and returned it with a steadier hand, as if the heat had lined her voice with threat. Lila tucked the drawing into her pocket like a deed. Clara touched the scarf at her throat and seemed surprised that it fit as though made for her. She looked at the ranch house, at the barn, at the blue cut of far hills, and something careful inside her sat down and stared. Elias studied the sky the way ranchers do when they are counting more than weather. He did not ask for vows. He offered work, protection, and time. Clara met his eyes and gave the one promise she could honor that minute. She would not run from the truth or from the two hearts who had given her a name. Lila slid her hand into Clara's and did not let go. The air bit, the sun shone, and 3 lives, held by a tree and a creek, tightened their knot and prepared for what dusk might bring. Far fences clicked as wire cooled under the sun. That evening, late morning broke open and flung gold across Red Willow. Frost eased from the grass. The sycamore let fall a last quiet drift. Elias stood in the yard with Clara beside him, and Lila at his knee, paper drawing tucked into the child's pocket like a promise. Dust rose on the road before sound arrived. Detective Amos Reed came first, coat flapping, horse dark with sweat. 2 riders followed, and behind them Deputy Lyle's wagon rattled over ruts. Reed swung down, produced a folded paper, and read in a voice meant to carry, warrant for the detention of Clara Bellamy on suspicion of arson at Hollow Creek Orphanage. The seal flashed like cold metal. Lyle added, "Turner, bring her forward." Clara's breath caught. The name fit and hurt. Elias shifted until his sleeve touched hers, a steadying contact. Lila bolted from the porch and raised her small fist. "She's my mama." The cry cracked the yard's murmur and left a clear hush. A path opened as an elderly woman advanced with a cane and a smoke-colored shawl. "Margaret Voss," she announced, eyes level, 5 years in Hollow Creek's laundry. I saw ledgers neat as copybooks and meanings foul as ditchwater. I heard doors bolted from the outside and watched wagons leave after moonrise. She faced Reed and Lyle. "You want the book? North wall, coal chute, loose stone underneath." I watched this girl pry it free while pans clanged and Corbett counted money like hens. If fire spared that wall, the pages still speak. Wind lifted shawls, the sycamore rained more gold. Reed weighed the witness with a rider's cool regard. Lyle scanned the fence line and read a different force. Neighbors who had decided what town they meant to be. "We confirm," he said. Reed folded the warrant without dulling its edge and gestured to his men. Mrs. Voss led them toward the road at a trot, wagon jolting after. The yard settled into a waiting that felt like prayer. Hester Pike set a hand on Clara's arm. Mr. Sutter removed his hat. Whit Carter said nothing and looked toward the hills. Elias did the most valuable work he knew, standing calm where fear wanted noise. Sun slid out from behind a torn veil. Hooves returned. Lyle stood in the wagon, coat dusted with ash, something wrapped in burlap in his hands. When he jumped down, voices died. He unrolled the square and held up a ledger with burned corners and buckled pages. He opened to a center spread. Names ran like fence posts. Dates and amounts walked beside them. At a margin curled the same initials that had stained the sack by the creek. Miss Hale's hand flew to her throat. Hester whispered, "Mercy," in a tone that made the words sound like justice at last. Whit shut his mouth on a curse and glanced at Lila before it could escape. Reed received the ledger as if it might explode. He read 3 pages, fast and exact, then closed the cover with care. His voice softened. "Statements, signatures, and a guard to Cheyenne by sundown," he said. Lyle turned to Clara, began with iron, then adjusted. "You'll testify tomorrow. You'll sleep here tonight." He slid the warrant into his coat, as if tucking away a tool until morning. Relief didn't cheer, it breathed. Shoulders fell, knees unlocked, breath moved again. Mrs. Voss planted her cane and met the yard with a soldier's stare. "That book is a map," she said. Follow it and fetch home what was sold. She reached for Clara's cheek with a hand that smelled of lye and roses. You spoke when I couldn't. You're not alone. Voices rose not in clamor, but in a careful swell, the kind that builds when fear loosens and decency finds breath. Miss Sutter vowed to ride fence with wit so Elias could keep watch by the barn. Hester promised hot broth for anyone holding the road. The Carter boys offered to sit at the creek bend, where strangers might try a back way. Miss Hale, cheeks wet, told Lyle she would swear to nights she heard wagons, when the clock said decent folks slept. Reed let the town arrange itself and made a neat list of witnesses, routes and names to be served by dawn. He added that any man who moved the ledger or threatened a witness would meet irons before sundown, badge or bank book notwithstanding, and that the safest place for truth tonight was under many eyes and one stubborn tree that had already seen enough secret. Who in your life deserves a second chance? Consider it. The thought sounded like a bell, and drifted over faces already changed by the sight of a ledger closed and a door opening. Elias turned under the sycamore and drew a ring from his pocket, a plain band mellowed to weep. He had carried it since the funeral, without knowing what day it waited for. Clouds parted wider, light poured down the trunk. He faced Clara without ceremony. I can't promise ease, he said. I can promise steadiness, and I'll stand with you when that book drags shadows into day. Marry me. Lila bounced, half laugh, half sob. She pressed the drawing to Clara's hip. Say yes, Mama. Clara examined the ring, the hand that offered it, and the child who had named her into courage. Bruises ached, ribs tugged. Hope gathered anyway. Yes, she said, and the word felt like water over hot iron. Elias slid the band onto her finger, where it settled as if time had fitted it in secret. Sun sharpened until dust glittered. The sycamore's last leaves quilted the ground. Reed tipped his hat and began to list the work ahead. Lyle posted riders at the lane and promised a watch through the night. Neighbors shifted closer instead of drifting away. Hester produced cups from a basket nobody recalled her carrying. Miss Hale promised blankets and asked Lila to save her a slice of cake when spring brought a proper wedding. Wit offered a team and a wagon that wouldn't rattle truth loose. Elias drew Clara beneath the brightest bough. They didn't reach for showy gestures. The day had given enough. Foreheads, Lila wedged between them, practical with joy. The cloud bank peeled apart, and light fell full on three shadows that crossed and fused on pale ground into one. Around them the valley returned to its tasks. Cattle nosed at grass. The creek stitched light to shade. Wagons creaked toward kitchens, yet the air felt rinsed, as if justice had opened windows. Reed packed the ledger and mounted. Lyle nodded once and rode to set post. No one wished to miss the last brightness sliding through rifts. Clara lifted her left hand and watched old gold glow. She looked at Elias and saw steadiness that made promises feel like beams, not ribbons. Lila tugged her sleeves and announced with authority that the wedding would be under this tree when blossoms showed, and the creek learned new songs. The sun broke one last time, gilding breath, boards, faces, and ring. For a minute the world seemed to hold its palm open, golden sunlight pouring through, frost flashing and fading, leaves drifting like benediction, while three lives once scattered by fire and fear assembled under a sycamore and chose their future out loud. Spring loosened winter's grip on Red Willow. Snow slumped from fences while the creek flashed bright through thawed bends. Buds tipped the sycamore's twigs. Grass stirred in patches, and calves bawled in the lower field. Elias planted cedar and fixed a simple arbor beside the old trunk. Lila fetched nails from a tobacco tin, solemn as a foreman. Clara held rails steady and smiled when sunlight warmed skin where bruises had faded to quiet shadow. Cheyenne sent the final word with dust on the envelope. The ledger's script matched receipts and testimonies. Warrants flew in 3 counties. Corbett faced irons. 2 men who hauled night wagons joined her. A judge cleared Clara Bellamy, naming her a witness, not a culprit. Reed's riders kept watch out of habit rather than fear. Lyle posted the notice on the board and left with a grin he seldom wore. The valley let itself breathe again. Neighbors returned to work. Hester Pike baked. Mrs. Hale gathered quilts. Whit Carter hauled hay bales for benches, and Mr. Sutter smoothed ruts, so wheels wouldn't rattle truth loose. Mrs. Voss stitched a sash the color of lilac, and said it belonged to any mother who'd carried fire through a night and come out holding a name. Lila paraded through the yard wearing it like a banner, until she remembered it should rest for a proper hour. Elias lifted the frame with Whit's help, sighted along the ridge, and tied it square. He shaped arch pieces the way he shaped talk. Careful, measured, honest. Clara threaded willow switches through cedar and tucked a blue scarf at the back rung, not as a relic as kinship. Lila tied 2 strips of calico and declared them flutter flags for happiness. Wind saw the idea and agreed. The clearing day arrived with a high sky and white clouds stretched thin as lace. People came with baskets, folded blankets, tin jugs and bunches of wild flowers, larkspur, lupine, early paintbrush. Children raced up the lane, then tried to walk solemnly when grown-ups looked. Hester lined pies on a plank balanced over sawhorses. Mrs. Voss rode in on Whit's wagon, cane tapping time, shawl smelling faintly of lavender and smoke. Elias stepped from the barn in a clean shirt and a vest his first wife had sewn with even stitches. He wore boots that had carried him through frost and worry, polished now but still true. Clara emerged from the house in a plain ivory dress. Mrs. Hale had pieced from muslin and lace, kept too long in a trunk. Sunlight found her and brightened the yard. Lila carried 3 daisies and a wooden horse, chin high and eyes fierce with gladness. Under the arbor the preacher rubbed the cold from his hands and grinned like a man who loves good work. He spoke about days that cut and days that mend, about a valley that watched one family unravel and a new one knit, about mercy that does not cancel law, but teaches it manners. He named wind, frost, hunger, and fear, then called patience, courage, and hope by name. He said love proves itself by weather, not speeches. When the preacher asked for vows, Elias answered with steadiness already shown. He pledged harbor when storms grow teeth, truth when noise tempts evasion, and work each sunrise until hands forget to count. Clara promised to meet day without running, to speak when silence would serve harm, to keep laughter in reach, even when cold returns to test old seams, and to mother with open doors and firm boundaries. Lila announced she would share cookies with anyone who earned them and not one crumb with scoundrels. Rings slid home, fingers lingered, breath rose and fell together. The preacher lifted both hands. What storms couldn't break, let no rumor fray, he said, and sunlight poured through a rift in the cloud like honey from a warmed jar. Wind lifted calico flags into a happy dance. The hidden scarf answered with a small nod, as though past and present had agreed to keep each other company. They kissed. Lila cheered, then hugged both knees at once and scattered her daisies. To general delight, Mrs. Hale declared that meant blossoms for everyone, and tucked petals into the arbor's corners. Pans clanged, plates appeared, coffee steamed, and pie vanished. Whit drew a fiddle from a feed sack, and somebody raised a mouth harp. Boots thudded on boards in a pattern older than fences. Clara's laugh braided through music and made every ear feel welcome. After blessings and 3 toasts, Elias saddled 2 horses and brought out a pony patched white and bay. Lila took the reins with proper gravity, then broke into giggles when the pony chose a prance over a wall. They looped the field above the creek while neighbors cheered every turn as if it were daring. Clara rode easily despite ribs that still noticed the weather, eyes shining when Lila's hair flew. Elias kept pace with a steady grin, like a man who found what he never planned to seek again. They veered along the ridge. Snow lingered where shadows kept it, melting into runnels that stitched silver through grass. Meadow larks traded bright notes. Hoofbeats drummed a patient rhythm. Clara looked back and saw the arbor small against the sycamore. Calico flags, soft as birds. She felt gratitude move through her body like warmth returning to cold hands. Evening drew a blue wash into the gullies. The preacher blessed leftovers and handshakes with the same gravity he gave vows. Reed pressed a card into Mrs. Voss's palm with an address for any message she cared to send. Lyle promised a watch on the lane through calving, and told Lila he expected pie standards enforced with fairness. People eased toward home in small streams. Quilts came down, baskets emptied, benches. Elias and Clara stood beneath the arbor as wind combed willow leaves and the last warmth pooled around their boots. Lila slipped the wooden horse into a pocket and rescued one daisy from trampled grass. She tucked it behind Clara's ear and patted the scarf like a badge of office. Now we're proper, she decided. The creek kept its spring song. Stars waited for their cue behind the thinnest cloud. Work waited in the morning, and all three looked forward to it. Morning brought chores and laughter that did not apologize. Letters arrived from Cheyenne marking trial dates, schedules, and escort plans for children reclaimed from far towns. Volunteers signed their names in tidy columns. Mrs. Hale organized baskets for riders. Hester assembled quilts. Mrs. Voss wrote statements in a slow, beautiful hand. Reed's men rotated posts until vigilance became habit without sharp edges. The town stayed itself and also something larger. By week's end, the arbor smelled of sun and cedar. Clara hung a length of lace from one crosspiece, because it made the wind look dressed for company. Lila kept 3 daisies in a chipped blue cup on the porch. Elias greased the harness, mended the fence and marked a second gate where a shortcut would save steps during lambing. None of it felt ordinary, though all of it was. That is how peace works. It returns tasks and lets hearts notice them. They rode again that Saturday, Lila on the pony, Elias and Clara abreast. The field unrolled bright and wide. Puddles mirrored sky and every breath tasted green. Far fences clicked as wire cooled under the sun. The creek sang louder, delighted by the melt. The three of them hurried, slowed, turned and laughed until the sound felt like a new season settling for good. If Elias, Clara and Lila's story moved you, share it below. What moment hit you hardest? Subscribe to Frontier Hearts for more tales of love and courage in the Wild West. Keep these stories alive.